Hi, my name is Dr. Stephen Himes. I'm the creator of Living Literature. It's a Substack and a podcast that steps you through great works of literature, paragraph by paragraph. I was going to write a companion post to a piece that I'm getting ready to publish about season 1 of Living Literature, A Christmas Carol. What was Charles Dickens's situation in 1843? Charles Dickens grew up poor. His father in the debtor's prison, and Charles Dickens went to work in Warren's blacking factory to earn enough money to get his father out of prison. And he became an apprentice writer to a lawyer, and then went on to become the most famous novelist in English history. That is roughly true. And where the story picks up for Christmas Carol is that Charles Dickens had become famous writing the Pickwick Papers and Oliver Twist, shot to instant stardom. Afterwards, he had a couple of bombs, and this is where books like Mr. Dickens and His Carol or The Man Who Invented Christmas book and movie pick up the story. And that Charles Dickens was overspending, he had a big family, he was a big celebrity, but Martin Chuzzlewit, that novel wasn't, he had spent a whole lot of money traveling to America. He really, really needed to write a hit. And that's where A Christmas Carol comes. And so these fictionalized accounts, like in Mr. Dickens and His Carol, they show Charles Dickens as this devoted family man. It gets in his head all of these characters, either around London or from his past, that then become A Christmas Carol, especially in The Man Who Invented Christmas. Dickens is walking around London, and then you immediately recognize the people that he meets as characters in Christmas Carol. Actually, in these stories, the most autobiographical part of A Christmas Carol for Charles Dickens was this: the Cratchit House. This is little known, but you can still see it in London today. Part of Charles Dickens's childhood was spent in a house in Camden, which is in North London. If you've ever heard of Camden today, it might be because that was like the epicenter of punk rock in the 70s, new wave in the 80s. It's where Amy Winehouse lived. It was a slum for a long time, and then it became an artist and kind of punk rock neighborhood. And that was where Charles Dickens spent a lot of his childhood in the 1840s. John Dickens' father had a job in the city of London, Somerset House, and he would walk out to Camden every day. It was a mile and a half walk. And this is, again, the most autobiographical part of A Christmas Carol, because Bob Cratchit, who worked at Scrooge's office in Cornhill in the center of London, down by the Thames, had to walk an hour and a half to get home to play Blind Man's Bluff on Christmas Eve. So where did A Christmas Carol really come from? Yes, he needed it. But Charles Dickens had, by this time, had become famous enough that he was actually a social justice advocate. A lot of his writing wasn't necessarily fiction. He was primarily a journalist. And so this is, in 1843, the time at the height of the Industrial Revolution. A little bit less so in London, but much more so in Manchester, England. All of the horrors, the Industrial Revolution, children in factories, people losing their limbs in cotton gin, all of that horror is reaching its peak right now in 1843. Dickens was moved by the second report of the Children's Employment Commission, which Parliament put out as a report on the horrific conditions in these factories, and specifically the horrific conditions that children as young as 8 were forced to endure while being forced into employment in these factories. Now you might say, oh, that's a familiar part of the story because Charles Dickens was forced to work in this boot polish factory. Well, I'll take a little aside here. That may or may not be true. This book, The Life and Lives of Charles Dickens by Helena Kelly, came out a couple of years ago. She really goes through the historical record and checks the receipts. Do we know that Charles Dickens actually was forced to work in this blacking factory? Because the only source that we have for that story is John Forster, who was Dickens's best friend and hand-picked biographer. And Forster wrote in his initial biography of Dickens that much later in life, Charles confided in him about his horrific child and told him all about the deep-seated shame and guilt that he had from working in this blacking factory. That's really the only source that we have. It was never known while Charles Dickens was alive. It was a story that Charles Dickens said to his best friend and handpicked biographer, knowing that John Forster was going to write a biography of Dickens's life after he died. At this point, we know Dickens was famous, the world's first modern media celebrity. And so he was always in the business of cultivating brand Dickens. And he was performing the part of Charles Dickens, famous author, even while he was alive. So there is some question about whether this story is even true or not. Regardless, here is what we know from the historical record. We know this from troves of Dickens's letters. For instance, he was really good friends with Angela Burnett Coutts, who was the richest woman in England at the time, who had inherited a whole banking industry from her husband. If you go to Fleet Street in London, you can still see Coutts Bank today, which is the model for Gringotts Bank in Harry Potter. And in recent times, we have also now discovered many more letters that Charles Dickens wrote to various people. So we actually have a pretty solid historical record for what was going on with Charles Dickens in September, October, and November of 1843. He visited a Field Lane Ragged School in London at the invitation of Angela Coutts. And so he got to see the horrid conditions that these boys had to endure. And he went to the Cornish tin mines in southwestern England, which is a forerunner of the worst coal mining that you can imagine from the early 20th century, northern England and Wales. Charles Dickens went and saw all of it. And then he took a trip to Manchester, where he got to see all the horrors of the Industrial Revolution, the polluted rivers, the stank throughout the city, people walking the streets without limbs, living in shanty town. Dickens saw the whole thing. Gave a speech, the Manchester Athenaeum, in October of 1843, in which he conveyed to his mostly middle-class bourgeois audience the terrors, the horrors that were happening in England at that time because of all of this industrial revolution squalor. And it didn't go well. What we know from his letters is that the thing that he discovered after that speech in October was that if we were ever going to make any progress on this issue in England, that journalism and polemics and essays, none of that was going to affect the audience. Charles Dickens was very attuned to his audience, and he could feel in the crowd. This wasn't a thing that acts and journalism were going to touch. And so he consciously set out with the idea that he would write a heart-tugging Christmas story that was centered on the horrors of the Industrial Revolution and the conditions of children as a means of persuasion for social reform at the Industrial Revolution of England. So long story short, he did it. He wrote this immaculate story, maybe the most famous in all of the English language, in about a month. So that's where A Christmas Carol comes from. But what has animated me about Dickens over the last couple of years, in my favorite biography of Dickens, which is by Claire Tomlin, who I've met, this is my autograph copy. She wrote about the publication of A Christmas Carol, and she said, Thomas Carlyle, Friedrich Engels, and Charles Dickens were all fired with anger and horror at the indifference of the rich to the fate of the poor, who had almost no access to education, no care in sickness, saw their young children set to work for ruthless factory owners, and could consider themselves lucky if they were only half starved. Tomlin just sort of lets that line go, and then there's a little bit of story. Dickens' historian was Thomas Carlyle threw a party for Dickens, and he was like a sweaty mess. He was very overcome that he pulled this off. Helena Kelly talks about how in Dickens' correspondence that he was overcome emotionally because this story is really about revisiting the past. And she posits that Harriet Dickens is actually the model for Dickens' sister, Harriet Dickens being the sister who died in Charles's childhood. I want to hold for a second on Thomas Carlyle, Friedrich Engels, and Charles Dickens. Those three guys are maybe the most consequential thinkers in the Anglo-European sphere of the 19th century. Thomas Carlyle is the founding father of fascist philosophy. The philosopher in residence for the MAGA movement, Curtis Yarvin, has cited Thomas Carlyle as the most influential thinker, but he even named his part of his movement the Carlyle Society. Thomas Carlyle's biography of Frederick the Great was actually in the Führer bunker at the end of World War II. So, the intellectual godfather of fascism, Thomas Carlyle, was deeply influenced by the Industrial Revolution in the exact same time and place as Friedrich Engels, who became Karl Marx's lifelong writing partner and even the curator of Marx's legacy after Marx died. Truth be told, was every bit as influential. He was a true partner with Karl Marx. And Friedrich Engels was deeply influenced by the Industrial Revolution. I mean, so much that his family actually owned factories in not just Manchester, but there was one in Salford, which is a little suburb right outside of Manchester. His parents sent him to go run the family business to get him away from his radical politics, and one of the all-time parenting backfires in history. So Friedrich Engels wasn't just influenced by the Industrial Revolution, he was living it and doing it. In 1843, and on his way to Manchester from Germany, that is where he met Karl Marx in London. And that's where they began this lifelong collaboration. And so Friedrich Engels was writing lines of a critique of political economy at the same time that Charles Dickens was writing A Christmas Carol. And so in this month of October of 1843, you have the founding fathers of fascism, communism, and whatever Dickens is, all worked at the same time during this single month. It's something that I've been thinking very deeply about. That's why the first two seasons of Living Literature are going to be about A Christmas Carol and A Tale of Two Cities. One of the most famous articles about Charles Dickens ever written was by George Orwell, and he begins his essay on Charles Dickens with Lenin and Krupskaya going to a production of The Cricket on the Hearth, which is one of Dickens's Christmas stories. And they were completely disgusted by the middle-class values, and bourgeois values, and complete lack of class content in Dickens. Like, Lenin talked a lot about how much he hated Dickens. Like, we think of him as like some sort of like big social justice advocate. But man, he hated trade unions. Like, there is no way could you ever call Dickens a leftist at all. And he's not really a conservative either. He's got his own thing that sits in between Carlyle, Marx, and Engels that is, for me, really fascinating to think about. And it actually has made sense of what we are living through right now. That's enough biographical and historical information to get started. A lot has been written about A Christmas Carol over the years, and it's one of the most covered pieces of literature in our canon. But I'm really going to try to approach it in a different way that is based on all of my years of teaching Dickens and spending a lot of time in the city of London, where all of the story takes place. So I'm going to bring that to life for you. If there is anything that you would like to know more about, biography of Charles Dickens, the writing of A Christmas Carol, Dickens's relationship to Thomas Carlyle and Marx and Engels, drop that in the chat. This is how we make literature live in my world. I hope that you come on this journey with me. It's a great read for the Christmas season.